November 2nd, 2022, 9:11 a.m. Chapter 11. The setting is Dyer County, where we interpret Article 1 Section 22 of the Tennessee State Constitution as under it monopolies are forbidden for those in the Royal Assembly of Greater Men.
Article I Section 22. Dyer County. Monopolies prohibited by law. In a westernmost portion of the state and a county below the most northwestern county through a private Tennessee Act on October 16, 1823, Dyer County was founded. Previously considered to belong legally to the Chickasaw Native Americans, the area was known as Indian lands. Being opposed to European American encroachment by settlers on their territory, though they were one of the most assimilated Native American nations, natives proved rebellious as the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek in 1832 was signed into law. It is not like as soon as the treaty was signed every Native American dropped their arms, because even the native population had outlaws who were far too invested in assimilation and remained resisting well after in their association with the Royal Assembly of Greater Men of Dyer County. One of the five main ones, the Chickasaw, were considered a civilized tribe, and some so much so that they adopted Christianity, European names, and consequently property, animate and inanimate. So, with one family passing for white, the outlaw Chickasaw would live in the shadows of the plantation where they benefited under the Green family. Claims for land quickly were exhausted after 1823 as the introduction of slavery and the wealth one may amass encouraged investment in the county, but it would take time and manpower to mold the land into as much an agricultural asset as possible.
The Greens participated in the slave trade, but only to breed the native/black mulatto population or at the request of the Royal Assembly, who were called the Philip Sons. The Greens and Philip Sons had much trade between each other though, because both knew the other were just passing for English better than the average white man, because only the ones who'd mastered the language would be the representative on foreign affairs. Foreign affairs are meant as any outside force, because the Indian Removal Act relocated most of the native population of Dyer County, and the Royal Assembly had been privatized since the Revolution. Neither needed the publicity of being more than just ordinary prosperous plantation owners with a considerable number of slaves legally or illegally. Both plantations were havens for those sympathetic to their causes, but they couldn't harbor runaways as it would jeopardize the harmony of biological order in their breeding processes. There was a certain amount of culture which came along with being in the Royal Assembly, as the atmosphere was the main concern. The plantations owned by the Chickasaw and Royal Assembly nuclei respectively helped ease life for a weary customer by always playing the piano to brighten or dim the mood and setting of a space.
Henry Louis Phillipson was a master at changing the usually drab atmosphere of Dyer County into a royal court of artisans and musicians, a scholar, a gentleman, a slave, and greater man. Those at the Phillipson plantation knew they had a role to play and ran it seemingly more efficiently than others who used slave labor. They planted crops because their shares in the stock at Phillipson would increasingly grow as opposed to being sold off a plantation without a quarter. They cooked dinner in the big house just to keep up appearances as they were the freemen, and would always take their overly condescending acts and facts of truth as proof of moral rightness and ethical goodness. The problems in society between blacks and whites were not so much so at the Greens or Phillipson's plantations. All this was controlled by autonomous governing structure of nobility under the Phillipson name, while the Greens formed the House of Commons to educate all to be representatives, literate representatives. So, outdoor schools were created specifically to teach English while through a wide array of practical subjects. One such subject was music, where Henry Arthur Phillipson excelled in the piano. Playing faithfully whenever he could, the spirits of all those in his presence were lifted as the soothing tunes from the piano would alter the listener's attitude. As the Phillipson and Green plantations both had pianos, when the pianist wasn't at one he was at the other, when he wasn't fighting.
It was said that Henry Louis Phillipson was a descendant of Louis Philippe, who stopped near the Obion River's mouth, where he killed a bald eagle around 1823. While the man who would become the last king of the French was in exile, his travels in North America brought him through the area of Dyer County, where Henry Phillipson's grandfather would settle as the new county was founded. The man who would be king had a counterpart of the African persuasion and of the same name. Opponents didn't know whether to hate the pianist because he was the heir apparent to the Phillipson order of nobility, because his family through Louis Philippe killed a bald eagle, or because he was essentially French, but knew English better than most. One of the only things on his side was his ability to manipulate a piano, because in Dyer County the greater men were increasingly being outnumbered by the influx of uncivilized slaves who couldn't read or write. The Greens and Phillipsons engulfed in a battle to outbreed the influx and concentrate on educating the youth under their auspices to a more refined way of life.
Holding a monopoly on black education in Dyer County, it would soon become clear how to distinguish the proletariats. The walk, the talk, and the mannerism of those on the Green and Phillipson plantations proved them superior, or one could at least say more civilized. The pianist was a tough act to follow, as one would wonder how hands that could make such beautiful music could be the author of the acts of violence it took him to take and hold the title. See, nobility has more to do with the order of politics than actual politics itself. An almost impenetrable barrier, the Royal Assembly of Greater Men of Dyer County protected Henry Louis Phillipson from trivial altercations as if he were king, when all he wanted to do was play the piano. His love for it made him humbler and deserving of his titles. That concludes the information for this time. Now we will entertain any questions before our second pop quiz.